The ambulance
What is
bay
going
at
on? Why
Mercy
is she in
General Medical
handcuffs?
Center faced
Ma'am,
east,
please step back. We have to
which
take her
meant
in.
that
It's a
on morning
misunderstanding. I had
shifts,
to.
the light came in flat and strong and lit the bay in the specific way that made every surface visible. The concrete, the yellow painted lines, the two idle gurneys against the wall, the red emergency placard above the automatic doors. Claudette Marie Okafor knew the ambulance bay the way she knew every room in the hospital by its smells and its sounds and its spatial logic, the specific arrangement of things that tells you without thinking what is happening and what needs to happen next. She had been a registered nurse for 29 years. For the last 14 of those years, she had been the charge nurse of the Surgical Intensive Care Unit at Mercy General, which was the position she had earned through 2 decades of the kind of work that makes other people quiet when you walk into a room, because the room understands that you know what you are doing. She was 57 years old, with close-cropped natural hair that had gone silver at the temples in the last 3 years, and she wore her hospital badge on the lanyard she had been wearing since 2009, the one her daughter had given her with the cartoon stethoscope border that had faded significantly, but that she had never replaced. She wore it because her daughter had chosen it. She intended to wear it until it fell apart. She had started nursing at Mercy General in 2005 after 5 years at St. Vincent's across town, which she had left because Mercy General had the better surgical program, and she knew as early as her 2nd year in nursing that surgical care was what she was built for. She had been built for the intensity of it, the particular combination of technical precision and human presence that surgical nursing required the ability to hold simultaneously a complete picture of a patient's physiological state and a complete picture of the room's human situation and to move between them without losing either. She had been told by the nurse educator who certified her in critical care in 2004 that this ability was not teachable. He had said, "I can teach you the protocols. What you already have, I cannot give anybody." She had said, "I'll use both." He had said, "I know you will." She had become the SICU charge nurse at 43, which was young for the role at Mercy General, where the position had traditionally gone to nurses in their mid to late 40s, with at least 15 years of critical care experience. She had 15 years of critical care experience at 43 because she had started early and had not slowed down. The nursing director who had appointed her, a woman named Eleanor Graves, who had been at Mercy General for 30 years and who had seen a great many nurses in that time, had said at the appointment meeting, "The SICU has needed you in this chair for 3 years. We should have asked sooner." Eleanor Graves had retired in 2019. Claudette had been at her retirement party. She had sat at Eleanor's table, and they had drunk champagne, and Eleanor had said, "Whatever happens in that unit, you are the unit. You know that." Claudette had said, "I know it." Eleanor had said, "Make sure everyone else knows it too." Claudette had said, "They do." Eleanor had said, "Good. Keep it that way." She wore the lanyard every day because her daughter Simone had bought it at a nurses' appreciation event when Simone was 9 years old in 2009, when Claudette had brought Simone to the hospital for Take Your Child to Work Day. Simone had walked the SICU with her mother that day, had stood at the nursing station and watched the monitors and had asked with the focused curiosity of a 9-year-old who has found something that interests her completely, "What do all those numbers mean?" And Claudette had explained the blood pressure and the heart rate and the oxygen saturation and the waveforms, had explained them at the level a 9-year-old could receive, which was a higher level than most adults might expect, because Simone had always received things at a higher level than her age suggested. By the end of the morning, Simone had known what the normal range for each number was and had correctly identified unprompted when one of the monitors in the nursing station showed a number outside its normal range. She had said that one looks different. Claudette had said yes. She had said, "Should someone go check?" Claudette had said, "I'm going right now." She had gone. She had thought, walking away from the nursing station, that child is going to be a doctor. Simone was 23 now in her 2nd year of medical school at Howard. When Claudette told people this, they said, "She's following in your footsteps." Claudette said she's making her own. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, and Claudette understood it because she had made her own footsteps too. Her mother had been a teacher, not a nurse, and her grandmother had been a seamstress, and Claudette had been the first in her family to choose clinical care, which meant she had walked into rooms with no map and had built the map as she went. Simone would have a map. Claudette had made sure of it. But Simone's path through the map would be her own, and that was the point. The morning had the quality of a Tuesday in late September, a degree cooler than the week before, with the light doing the specific thing that September light does, which is to arrive at a lower angle than August light, and to make familiar things look slightly different, as if the world is adjusting its presentation for the autumn. The parking lot at Mercy General had the smell of the morning shift beginning engine exhaust from the cars coming in, the specific chemical clean smell that hospitals exhale through their ventilation systems, and underneath both of those the faint organic smell of the adjacent green space where the hospital had planted a strip of native grasses along the east fence. She was standing outside the ambulance bay doors at 6:47 in the morning because she had arrived for a 7 o'clock shift and had stopped to call her mother before going in. Her mother was 81, lived in the assisted living facility 3 miles away, and woke at 6:15 every morning and waited for Claudette's call with the patient expectation of someone who has learned that people arrive when they say they will arrive. Claudette called at 6:45 every workday morning. She had been calling at 6:45 every workday morning for 4 years since her father died and her mother moved to the facility, and the calls became the thing that organized her mother's early morning into something with a shape. She had missed the 6:45 call 4 times in 4 years, all 4 of them on nights when she had worked double shifts and had not left the hospital until 6:30 and had called from the parking garage at 6:49 instead. She had called at 6:49 on those 4 mornings because being 4 minutes late was better than not calling, and because her mother had waited. Her father, Theodore, had died in 2019 in October on a Tuesday morning in the same kind of room that Claudette managed every day, an intensive care unit not at Mercy General but at a hospital 4 miles away where she had not worked and had no privileges, and where she had been a family member in a waiting room chair, which was the hardest position she had ever sat in. She had known from the nurse's voice on the phone the morning of that the situation had changed. She had known before the nurse finished the sentence. She had said, "I'm coming." She had said it to the nurse, and then she had said it to George, who was already in the kitchen, and she had driven those 4 miles in 11 minutes in the early morning with the specific, focused quiet of someone who is preparing to need to be useful. Her father had died at 9:43 that morning, with Claudette holding his right hand, and her mother, Loretta, holding his left. He had been a good man, an engineer, quiet, fond of mathematics and jazz, and the specific pleasure of a problem solved correctly. He had been proud of Claudette, the way fathers are proud when a child chooses work that matters and does it well. He had told her once in the last year before the diagnosis that began the decline that watching her work was like watching someone who had found the exact thing they were supposed to be doing. She had said, "I know what I'm supposed to be doing." He had said, "Most people don't." She had said, "You taught me how to look." He had said, "No, you taught yourself. I just didn't get in the way." Her mother's name was Loretta. Loretta Jean Okafor, née Washington, born in 1945 in Greensboro, North Carolina, retired elementary school principal widow of Theodore Okafor since 2019. She had been a principal for 18 years, a teacher for 12 years before that, and she had the particular quality of presence that belongs to people who have spent decades being responsible for rooms full of children. A warmth that was also a steadiness, a softness that was also a structure. She called Claudette by her full name. Always had. Not Claudette, Claudette Marie. The way your mother says your full name is a record of who you were when she first learned you and Loretta said Claudette Marie in the same way she had said it in 1967 with the specific care of someone who chose that name deliberately and means it the same way every time she uses it. Claudette called every weekday morning at 6:45. They talked for 6 to 8 minutes, sometimes less, if the night had been difficult. They talked about small things, the weather, the breakfast, the bird that had been coming to the facility's garden feeder. They sometimes talked about larger things. They talked about Simone, who was in medical school, and who Loretta believed with the absolute conviction of a grandmother was going to be the finest doctor in the history of the profession. Claudette said she'll be a fine doctor. Loretta said the finest. Claudette said we'll see. Loretta said, I already see. She was 81 years old and had earned the right to certainty. She had finished the call at 6:52. She was standing outside the ambulance bay doors with her phone in her hand and her badge on her lanyard and her SICU charge nurse identification visible on the chest of her scrub jacket, putting her phone in her pocket when Officer Raymond Holst approached from the parking lot. Raymond Holst was 34 years old. 8 years on the force, assigned to the hospital campus security patrol that supplemented Mercy General's own security team. The hospital campus patrol was a contracted arrangement with the city police department, a 4-officer rotation that covered the hospital grounds and the 2 adjacent parking structures. The arrangement had been put in place after a parking structure incident 3 years earlier in which a patient's family member had been followed to their car. The hospital had requested supplemental uniformed presence, and the city had agreed. Holst had been on the campus rotation for 7 months. He had 5 prior complaints on his personnel file, 2 for improper stop and frisk, 1 for excessive force during an arrest at a transit station in 2021, 2 for disrespectful conduct during civilian encounters in the 24 months before his campus assignment. All 5 had been reviewed by the department's Internal Affairs Division and closed without formal discipline. In 2 cases, the closure had cited insufficient evidence despite the existence of witness statements. In 1 case, the closure had cited the complainant's failure to attend a follow-up interview, which the complainant had been notified of by a letter that had been sent to an address the complainant had reported as changed 3 months earlier. The 3 closures were not connected in any record. They existed as 5 separate closed files, each filed under its own incident number, which meant that the pattern they formed together was visible only to someone who was looking for it and had access to all 5. No one at the department had yet looked. His supervisor had noted in the most recent performance evaluation that Holst demonstrated initiative in identifying potential security concerns on the campus grounds, a characterization that reflected more about the evaluation's author than about the accuracy of what initiative means. The characterization was filed in the evaluation. The evaluation was filed in the personnel record, and the personnel record sat in the same system as the 5 closed complaint files. He had seen Claudette Okafor standing outside the ambulance bay doors from across the parking lot. He had seen a woman with close-cropped silver hair standing near the ambulance bay entrance with a phone in her hand. He had made the same calculation he had been making for 7 months on this campus, the calculation that told him which people standing near hospital entrances belonged there and which ones needed to be assessed. The calculation was not based on identification badges or uniforms. It was based on something else. Something that he would not have been able to name precisely if asked, which was itself the most accurate thing about it. He said, "Ma'am, you need to be in the main entrance if you're a visitor." Claudette looked at him. She finished putting her phone in her pocket. She said, "I'm not a visitor. I work here." He said, "I'm going to need to see some identification." She said, "My badge is on my lanyard." She lifted the lanyard slightly so the badge was clearly visible. The badge had her photograph, her name, her unit, and her title. It also had the Mercy General Medical Center logo and the magnetic strip that allowed access to every secured area of the hospital that her position authorized. It had been issued by the hospital's Human Resources Department, was renewed annually, and contained more identifying information than a standard driver's license. He said that could be anyone's badge. I need a government-issued ID. She looked at him with the specific patience of a woman who has been doing the right thing for 29 years and has encountered in those years the specific variety of person who refuses to accept that the right thing has been done. She said, "Officer, I am the charge nurse of the Surgical Intensive Care Unit. I have worked at this hospital for 19 years. My shift begins in 7 minutes. I would like to go inside." He said, "Do you have government-issued ID with you?" She said, "I have my hospital badge, my parking permit registered to this facility, and my vehicle registration in my car, which shows my home address." She said, "All three identify me as Claudette Okafor, SICU charge nurse employed at this hospital." She said, "Which of those would you like to see?" He said, "I need a driver's license or state ID." She said, "I do not have my driver's license on me." I walked from the employee parking structure which is on hospital grounds, and my license is in my car. She said, "Would you like me to walk back to my car to retrieve it?" He said, "Do not walk away from me." She said, "I am offering to provide additional documentation. I am not walking away." She said, "Officer, I have 8 patients in the ICU whose morning assessments are beginning right now. I need to be inside this building." He said, "I said stay here." He said it with the voice that is not the voice of a request and is not quite the voice of an order, but occupies the space between them and uses the ambiguity of that space as a kind of power. She recognized the space. She had seen it before in different contexts. She stayed. He said, "I'm conducting a security assessment of the campus perimeter. I need you to step back from the entrance." She said, "On what basis?" He said, "I've had reports of unauthorized individuals in the ambulance bay area." She said, "I am an authorized individual. My badge demonstrates that. I would appreciate it if you allowed me to enter." He said, "Step back from the entrance, please." He said, "Please," the way someone says please when the word is a grammatical placeholder rather than a social gesture. She said, "I will step back 1 step." She did. She said, "I am now 3 feet from the entrance rather than 2 feet from the entrance." She said, "What specifically is the basis for this security assessment?" He said, "I told you there are reports of unauthorized access in the ambulance bay area." She said, "When were these reports made? What did they describe?" He said that information is not available to the public. She said, "I am not the public. I am a credentialed employee of this facility." She said, "Can you describe any behavior I have engaged in that constitutes unauthorized access?" He said, "You need to stop asking questions." She said, "I am asking for the legal basis for your authority to prevent me from entering my workplace." She said it in the tone that did not change regardless of what was happening around her, the tone of a person who has been trained to communicate clearly under pressure and who does not need to raise her voice to make a point land. He said, "I'm going to call this in and verify your employment status." She said, "Please do. Ask to speak with Marcus Wendell in hospital security. He has known me for 7 years. She said, "I'm going to call the security desk myself while you do that." She said, "I am telling you in advance that I am making a call." He said, "I said step back from the entrance, please." He said, "Please," the way someone says please when the word is a grammatical placeholder rather than a social gesture. She stepped back 1 step. She said, "I'm going to call the hospital's security desk." He said, "You're going to put down the phone and comply with my instructions." She did not put down the phone. She called the hospital security desk. The desk was staffed by Marcus Wendell, a 23-year Mercy General Security officer who knew Claudette Okafor's badge number, her face, her parking space number, and the fact that she brought the overnight security staff Christmas cookies every December without exception. He answered in 1 ring. She said, "Marcus, I'm outside the ambulance bay. An officer is blocking my entry." He said, "I'll be right out." Holst took the phone from her hand. He did it the way people do things they have not thought through quickly without announcing the action, as if the speed of it would absorb the reality of it, before either party had time to understand what had happened. He took the phone and put it in his jacket pocket and said, "I told you to put the phone down." Claudette Okafor stood very still. She was 57 years old, and she had been a charge nurse for 14 years, and she knew what it meant when a situation escalated past the point that logic could contain it. She knew it from codes, from the moment in a room when the patient's numbers went in the wrong direction and the time for discussion ended and the time for action began. This was a different kind of escalation, but the stillness required was the same. She said, "That is my personal property." He said, "You are interfering with a security operation." She said, "I'm a nurse trying to go to work." He said, "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." She was aware of several things at once. This was not unusual. 29 years of critical care nursing produces a specific kind of multi-channel awareness, the ability to track multiple inputs simultaneously and to organize them into a coherent picture without losing any of the individual threads. She tracked the sound of the ambulance bay's automatic doors, which had opened twice since the encounter began. She tracked the position of the 2 idle gurneys against the wall. She tracked the time, 6:57, which meant she had 3 minutes until her shift began, which meant the night charge was still in the SICU waiting for handover, which meant everything was running correctly except the fact that she was standing outside in handcuffs instead of inside at the nursing station. She thought about the overnight patient census. The SICU had 8 patients. 3 were ventilator-dependent, which meant their morning respiratory assessments were in progress right now. 1 patient had been flagged the previous evening for elevated troponin levels, which meant the morning labs needed to be pulled and reviewed before rounds. She knew all of this because she had read the overnight notes before leaving the previous evening, which was what she did every day before leaving, so that when she arrived in the morning she already had a picture of what the unit needed and could begin addressing it the moment she walked through the doors. She had built this practice over 14 years because the morning handover is the most vulnerable moment in a critical care unit's day, the moment when the overnight team is at the end of their capacity and the day team has not yet hit its stride. She closed that vulnerability by knowing both sides of it. She was the bridge. She needed to be on the bridge. The handcuffs made a sound against the concrete of the ambulance bay. The magnetic clasp of her SICU badge touched the ground when she bent forward. She stood up and the badge swung on the lanyard. The photograph on the badge showed Claudette Okafor at 54 3 years ago wearing the same scrub jacket, looking at the camera with the direct, unambiguous expression of a woman who is comfortable being seen. Marcus Wendell came through the ambulance bay doors 40 seconds later. He stopped when he saw what was happening. He said, "Officer, this is Claudette Okafor. She is the SICU charge nurse. She has worked here for 19 years. He said it the way you say something that should already be known." Holst said, "Please go back inside." Marcus said, "She is not." He stopped. He said, "I need to call the nursing director." Holst said, "Go back inside or I will detain you as well." Marcus went back inside. He called the nursing director. He called the hospital administrator on duty. He called the SICU directly. He called all 3 at once from his desk on 3 different phones. Inside the SICU, the morning shift had been beginning its handover. The night charge nurse, DeShawn Holloway, had been briefing the incoming staff on the overnight patient census. 4 patients on ventilator support, 1 post-surgical monitoring case, 2 on CRRT, 1 stable, and expected to transfer to a step-down unit by noon. The overnight had been busy. A post-cardiac surgery patient had developed a rhythm abnormality at 2 in the morning that had required 30 minutes of active management and a call to the cardiology fellow on call. The patient had stabilized by 2:45 and had remained stable through the rest of the overnight. DeShawn had documented the event in complete detail, which was what Claudette had taught him to do. Document everything. Document. It accurately documented as close to real time as possible, because the documentation is the record, and the record is what protects the patient and the staff both. DeShawn Holloway was 36 years old, had been in the SICU for 7 years, had worked under Claudette Okafor for all 7 of them. She had trained him to be a charge nurse, had spent 3 years doing it deliberately, assigning him the experiences he needed to build the specific competencies the role required. Debriefing him after difficult cases, giving him her thinking as well as her actions so that he could build his own thinking from the same foundation. He would be ready for the charge nurse role in 18 months by her assessment. She had told him so directly because she believed that people who are being developed deserve to know the shape of what they are being developed toward. He had said, "I still have things to learn." She had said, "That is true forever. It does not mean you're not ready." He had been at the whiteboard in the nursing station when the call came in from Marcus Wendell. He had listened for 11 seconds. Then he had said to the room, "Nurse Okafor has been detained outside the ambulance bay." He had said it once, and then he had gone to find Dr. Samuel Osei. Dr. Samuel Osei was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Mercy General. He was 61 years old, Ghanaian-born, trained at Johns Hopkins, and then at Cleveland Clinic, the author of 47 peer-reviewed publications in cardiothoracic surgery, and the holder of 3 patents for surgical technique modifications used in hospitals in 14 countries. He had come to Mercy General in 2006, the year after Claudette Okafor, and he had known her almost since his first week, when she had flagged a post-op patient of his whose troponin trend he had assessed as within acceptable range, and whose deterioration she had predicted with an accuracy that had required him. A man who trusted his own judgment rigorously, and with good reason, to sit in his office for 20 minutes and reconstruct how she had seen what he had not. He had gone to her office the next morning. He had said, "Walk me through how you read that troponin sequence." She had said, of course. She had laid out her reasoning in exact, organized terms. The trend over 6-hour intervals. The patient's baseline, the rate of change that the absolute numbers didn't show, but the rate of change showed clearly the additional 3 variables she had weighted and why. He had said, "I missed the rate." She had said, "You had 6 patients. I had 1 at that moment." He had said we should build a protocol for this sequence. She had said, "I've been using one." She had given him the documentation. He had added it to the standard post-op monitoring order for his service. He had been at Mercy General for 19 years, the same 19 years as Claudette Okafor, and he knew Claudette the way surgeons know charge nurses who are exceptional at their work, not as an employee, not as a subordinate, not as a supporting role, but as a person whose professional judgment he trusted more completely than he trusted the judgment of 2/3 of the physicians who rotated through his service. He had said to medical students and residents and fellows who asked about the SICU that if Claudette Okafor had a concern about a patient, you treated the concern as a finding, because in 14 years her concerns had been accurate more often than the diagnostic equipment. He was in the scrub room adjacent to OR3 preparing for a 730 aortic valve replacement when DeShawn found him. The patient was a 64-year-old woman named Margaret Holloway, no relation to DeShawn, who had been diagnosed with severe aortic stenosis 8 weeks earlier, and who had waited those 8 weeks with the specific patience of someone who has been told that the surgery that will improve her life requires preparation, and who has prepared and who was now on the table. The patient was already anesthetized. The surgical team was assembled: his senior resident, 2 scrub technicians, a circulating nurse, and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Priya Mehta, who had been doing cardiothoracic anesthesia for 16 years, and who had worked with Dr. Osei on more than 200 procedures. The perfusionist had the bypass machine ready. The chest cavity had been opened. Everything was in order. He listened to what DeShawn said. He put down the scrub brush. He walked to the OR3 door and opened it. He said to his resident, "Tell the team we are pausing." He said to the anesthesiologist, "Maintain." He said to the circulating nurse, "Call the administrator on duty and have her meet me at the ambulance bay." He walked through the hallway in his scrubs and his surgical cap, and his gloves still on from the scrub, which was an unusual sight in a hospital hallway and which produced in the people who saw him the specific alarm that is produced by seeing a surgeon leave a sterile preparation for reasons that are not procedural. A medical student near the elevator saw him and started to ask a question and thought better of it. A floor nurse near the nursing station saw him and picked up her phone. A resident coming out of the stairwell saw him and pressed himself against the wall to let him pass, and then stayed pressed against the wall for a moment after he had passed, because the posture of a senior surgeon walking with that kind of intent is not something you step into the path of. He did not run. He walked at the pace that senior surgeons walk with the authority of someone who has determined where they need to be and intends to be there. He came through the ambulance bay doors and saw Claudette Okafor standing with her hands behind her back in handcuffs and Raymond Holst standing 4 feet away with the field report started on his notepad. Dr. Osei came through the ambulance bay doors and stopped. He stood in the doorway for 2 seconds. A very precise 2 seconds. The pause of a person who is assessing a situation completely before acting on it. He saw Claudette Okafor standing with her hands secured behind her. He saw Holst with the notepad. He saw Marcus Wendell visible through the security desk window. He saw the ambulance bay camera mounted above the entrance, its red indicator light steady and active. Dr. Osei said, "Remove those handcuffs." Holst said, "Sir, this is a police matter." Dr. Osei said, "This woman is the charge nurse of my surgical intensive care unit. I have a patient on the table in OR3 whose chest is open." He said it the way he said things in the OR, precisely without wasted syllables, with the specific authority of someone who has made a decision and is communicating it, not discussing it. He said, "Remove those handcuffs immediately." Holst said, "I need to complete my assessment before." Dr. Osei said, "You have 30 seconds to remove those handcuffs, or I am going to call the hospital's chief of security, the chief of medicine, and the hospital's legal counsel simultaneously. And each of them is going to ask the same question. What is the legal basis for the detention of a credentialed hospital employee outside a federally funded medical facility which falls under specific regulations governing patient access to healthcare staff?" He said, "I know those regulations because I have read them." He said, "I am not going back into that operating room until she is free." He said it as a fact, not a threat. A fact has a different weight than a threat. A threat is conditional. A fact is a statement of what is. The ambulance bay was quiet for a moment. Quiet in the way that spaces become quiet when a statement has been made that has used up all the air that arguments would have needed. The administrator on duty, Patricia Nwachukwu, came through the doors 20 seconds later. She had her phone to her ear and a lanyard with her credentials around her neck and the specific expression of a hospital administrator who has been awake for 12 hours, managing a midnight crisis, and has been handed a second crisis at 6:55 in the morning. She looked at the scene in front of her, the surgeon in scrubs and surgical cap, the charge nurse in handcuffs, the officer with the notepad. She took 3 seconds to assess it. She said, "Officer, I am the administrator on duty at this facility. I need you to explain the legal basis for this detention." Holst said the subject was behaving suspiciously near the ambulance bay entrance. Patricia said the subject is Claudette Okafor. She is the SICU charge nurse. She has a Mercy General Facility badge, and she has been employed here for 19 years. What specifically was suspicious about her behavior? Holst said she was standing near the entrance and she declined to show government-issued identification. Patricia said hospital badges are accepted identification on this campus under the standing agreement between Mercy General and the City Police Department. She said, and a badge was shown. Holst said yes, but I couldn't verify. Patricia said you couldn't verify. She repeated it the way Beverly Patterson repeated things as a statement that contained within its repetition the acknowledgement of what the statement revealed. She said, "Remove the handcuffs, now." Holst did not remove them immediately. He looked at his notepad. He looked at Patricia. He looked at Dr. Osei. Dr. Osei said, "I have a patient whose chest is open on that table." He pointed in the direction of OR3 without turning around. He said, "I will not return to that room while she is in those handcuffs." He said, "Your call." The handcuffs came off. Claudette Okafor stood very still for a moment. Not the stillness of shock. The stillness of a woman who has just come through something and is assessing herself the way she would assess a patient systematically, from the inside out, looking for what requires attention. Her wrists were sore where the cuffs had been applied. Her badge was straight. Her scrub jacket was straight. Her breathing was even. Patricia Nwachukwu took her arm and said something quietly. Claudette looked at her and said, "I'm all right." Patricia said, "I know you are." She said it as a confirmation, not a consolation. There was a difference, and both women knew it, and the difference mattered. Claudette straightened her badge lanyard. She looked at her watch. She looked at Dr. Osei. She said, "Go back to your patient. I'll be in the SICU in 4 minutes." He said, 4 minutes. She said, 4 minutes, you have my word. He went. He went quickly, with the same pace he had arrived, with the pace of a man who knows exactly what needs to be done next and intends to do it. She watched him go back through the ambulance bay doors, and she thought that patient on that table has a very good surgeon. She had thought this many times over 19 years, and it was still true, and she was still glad it was true. She turned to Patricia and said, "I need the records of the calls Marcus made from the security desk at 6:53. She said, "And I need the footage from the ambulance bay camera, all of it from 6:47 forward." She said, "And I need the name of the officer's commanding officer, his badge number, and his assignment rotation." She said, "Before I go inside." Patricia said, "I'll have all of it within the hour." Claudette said, "Thank you." She looked at Holst for one moment. He had not moved from his position 4 feet from where she had been standing. She looked at him with the expression she had been practicing for 57 years, which was the expression that carries everything and shows nothing. And then she turned and walked through the ambulance bay doors. She was in the SICU in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She knew this because she looked at her watch when she came through the unit's entry doors, which was what she always did when she entered the SICU, because the SICU was a place that ran on time, and she was the person who kept it running. She went to the nursing station. DeShawn was still at the whiteboard. She said, "Where are we?" He said, "The patient census." She listened. She asked 2 questions. She wrote 3 things on the whiteboard. She began the handover. In OR 3, Dr. Osei completed the aortic valve replacement in 4 hours and 11 minutes, which was within the expected range for the procedure and which produced a patient outcome that the post-surgical report would describe 6 days later as excellent. He had returned to the scrub room at 7:02, washed again, and entered OR 3 at 7:08. He had not mentioned the ambulance bay to his surgical team. The team did not ask. They had heard what was happening through the same network that moves information through any hospital, quickly, incompletely, and often. The version that circulated by 8 o'clock was this. Dr. Osei had refused to operate until the cop outside the ambulance bay took the handcuffs off the charge nurse. That version was in its essentials accurate. In OR 3. During the 18 minutes that Dr. Osei was outside, Dr. Priya Mehta maintained the anesthetic and monitored Margaret Holloway's vitals. She tracked blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, and the bypass machine's output with the close and experienced attention of someone who has held a patient stable in complicated circumstances before. She said nothing to the surgical resident about what was happening. She said nothing to the scrub techs. She maintained. That was her job in that room at that moment. She did it. Dr. Osei returned at 7:08. He washed. He entered. He assessed the patient. He said good. He said it to Priya. She said stable throughout. He nodded. He began. Officer Holst filed his incident report at 7:20. The report described the encounter as a standard security assessment that had escalated due to the subject's non-compliance. He used the word non-compliance 4 times in the 2-page report. He did not describe in the report the moment he had taken Claudette's phone from her hand. He described it as a request to put down the device. The body camera had been active throughout the encounter. The body camera described the moment accurately and did not use the word request. The formal complaint was filed by the hospital's legal counsel with Claudette Okafor as the named complainant at 9:15 the same morning. The complaint cited unlawful seizure of personal property, the phone unlawful detention without specific articulable basis and conduct inconsistent with the standing protocol agreement between the hospital and the city police department. The protocol agreement had been signed 3 years earlier specifically to establish clear procedures for hospital campus security interactions, and to prevent exactly the kind of encounter that had occurred at 6:52 on a Tuesday morning at the ambulance bay doors. The city's Office of Professional Standards received the complaint the same day. The department's Internal Affairs Division received it 2 days later because the hospital's legal counsel sent it certified mail to the specific investigator named in the protocol agreement. The certified mail arrived on a Thursday, which meant the investigator had to acknowledge receipt within the required 48 hours, which made it substantially harder to route the complaint to the category where things are received and quietly set aside. The hospital's ambulance bay camera footage was preserved the same day. It showed 9 minutes and 44 seconds of the encounter, beginning with Holst's approach across the parking lot and ending with the handcuffs being removed. It showed every exchange. It showed Claudette's badge being held clearly visible. It showed Holst taking the phone. It showed Dr. Osei coming through the ambulance bay doors in his scrubs and cap and gloves. The footage was attached to the complaint as the primary exhibit and was also preserved in the hospital's security records. Dr. Osei submitted a written statement to the investigative record 5 pages, which described the encounter from his perspective and which spent 2 of its 5 pages on the medical context, the patient, the procedure, the timeline, and the institutional significance of the charge nurse's role in a surgical intensive care unit. He wrote that the charge nurse of a surgical ICU is not interchangeable with any other staff member on shift, that the institutional knowledge carried by a 14-year SICU charge nurse is specific and accumulated and cannot be replaced on 4 minutes' notice, and that the detention of Claudette Okafor outside the ambulance bay was not merely a personal injustice, but an institutional interference with patient care at a facility that was providing critical services to the community. He was 51 words over the length he had intended. He left all 51 in. The investigation was assigned to an investigator in the Office of Professional Standards named Denise Farrow, who had been investigating police misconduct complaints for 11 years and who had developed over those 11 years a specific method for reading complaint files. She read them twice. The first time she read for the stated facts. The second time she read for what the stated facts implied about the pattern around them. She read Holst's complaint file twice. Then she read his 5 prior complaints for the third time. She read the 5 prior complaints in sequence in chronological order, and then she read them again grouped by type, the stop and frisk incidents together, the force incident alone, the disrespectful conduct incidents together. She wrote in her preliminary notes 5 separate files. 1 pattern. The pattern should have been flagged at complaint 3. The investigation was completed in 7 weeks. The findings were that Holst had conducted a stop without specific articulable suspicion, had seized personal property without legal basis, and had failed to accept hospital-issued credentials in violation of the standing protocol agreement between Mercy General and the City Police Department. The findings on all 3 counts were sustained. In addition, Denise Farrow's pattern review produced a separate finding that the 5 prior complaints reviewed together documented a pattern of conduct consistent with racially motivated stops and property seizures, and that the pattern had not been identified or addressed in previous reviews. This finding was appended to the investigation record and forwarded to the department's Chief of Professional Standards. Holst was suspended for 30 days without pay and removed from the hospital campus patrol permanently. The pattern finding was placed in his personnel file as a permanent notation. His supervisor, the one who had characterized Holst's conduct as demonstrating initiative, received a formal counseling regarding the characterization and its relationship to the pattern that had gone unaddressed. The hospital's legal counsel requested and received a written commitment from the City Police Department that the protocol agreement would be reviewed and strengthened and that the specific credential acceptance requirement would be added to the mandatory training for all officers assigned to medical campus duty. The commitment was received in writing, signed by the department's deputy commissioner and countersigned by the hospital administrator. The protocol agreement was reviewed by a joint committee of hospital legal counsel and city police department representatives, which met twice in the 6 weeks following the investigation's conclusion. The committee produced a revised agreement with 4 new provisions: a clear definition of accepted hospital credential types, a required acknowledgement procedure for hospital-issued identification, a specific non-interference clause covering hospital staff during active patient care periods, and a grievance mechanism that required response within 5 business days. The revised agreement was signed by the hospital's CEO and the police department's chief of professional standards in a ceremony that was not covered by any news outlet and that lasted 11 minutes. The credential acceptance provision was strengthened in language that the committee's lawyer described as unambiguous. The training was added to the curriculum for the next quarterly cycle. All 4 officers currently on the hospital campus patrol were required to complete it within 30 days. 3 completed it within the first week. The 4th completed it on day 27. The deputy commissioner sent a copy of the updated agreement to the hospital administrator with a cover note that expressed the department's commitment to ensuring that what had occurred at the ambulance bay on a Tuesday morning would not occur again. Denise Farrow, the investigator, filed the case with a notation in her personal case log that she maintained separately from her official records, a log of cases that had produced pattern findings and that she monitored for follow-up. She had been keeping the log for 9 years. It had 43 entries. Most of them had produced some form of institutional change. Some of them had not. She noted the Holst case as having produced institutional change at 2 levels: the individual finding and the protocol revision. She noted it as a case worth watching. She intended to revisit it in 12 months to see whether the revised protocol had been followed in practice. She noted the date for the revisit. She had been doing this for 9 years, and the doing of it was, she believed, the part that actually mattered, not the case, not the finding, but the watching afterward, the return, the refusal to file the thing away and consider it finished. Patricia Nwachukwu acknowledged the letter. She shared it with the hospital's board of directors at the quarterly board meeting 3 weeks after the investigation closed. The board had already received a full report of the incident from the hospital's legal counsel and from Patricia herself, and the board's chair had asked at the first meeting after the incident what the hospital intended to do to ensure it did not occur again. Patricia had given 3 answers: the protocol agreement review, the training edition, and a new hospital policy requiring all campus security personnel to complete a credential recognition training specific to Mercy General's badge system. The board had approved all 3. The new policy was implemented within the month. She shared the deputy commissioner's letter with Claudette Okafor, who read it and filed it in the folder where she kept documentation of things that mattered and that should not be forgotten. She had started the folder 14 years ago when she became charge nurse, not because she expected the folder to be needed, but because she believed that the record of things that happen in a unit belongs to the unit, and that the charge nurse is the keeper of that record. The folder held performance reviews, incident reports, patient outcome summaries, letters from families, notes from residents. She had trained a photograph of the SICU staff from 2015 that was pinned to the inside cover with a binder clip. It now held a letter from a deputy police commissioner and the final investigation report from Denise Farrow's office with the pattern finding appended. She placed them in the folder in chronological order. It was a thick folder. Dr. Osei submitted a written statement to the investigative record, 5 pages, which described the encounter from his perspective and which spent 2 of its 5 pages on the medical context, the patient, the procedure, the timeline, and the institutional significance of the charge nurse's role in a surgical intensive care unit. He wrote that the charge nurse of a surgical ICU is not interchangeable with any other staff member on shift, that the institutional knowledge carried by a 14-year SICU charge nurse is specific and accumulated and cannot be replaced on 4 minutes' notice, and that the detention of Claudette Okafor outside the ambulance bay was not merely a personal injustice, but an institutional interference with patient care at a facility that was providing critical services to the community. He was 51 words over the length he had intended. He left all 51 in. Margaret Holloway went home 9 days after the aortic valve replacement. Her post-discharge report described her recovery as excellent and her prognosis as substantially improved. She sent a card to the SICU staff 2 weeks after discharge. The card had a picture of flowers on the front. Inside it said, "I don't know everything that happened while I was on that table, but I know someone was watching over me. Thank you for that." The card was posted on the SICU nursing station bulletin board. Claudette read it every time she passed the board for the same reason she read all the cards on the board, because the cards were the record of what the work was for, and the record of what the work was for was the thing that made the work sustainable. Claudette worked her shift that Tuesday. She was in the SICU by 3 minutes and 40 seconds past 7, and she ran the morning handover with the complete information DeShawn had prepared and the additional context she carried in her head from the previous evening's review of the overnight notes. She reviewed the overnight labs for the 4 ventilator-dependent patients and noted the troponin trend, and reviewed the CRRT patient's fluid balance, and assessed the step-down transfer candidate, and set the morning's priorities in the order the morning required. She attended morning rounds and contributed 3 clinical observations that changed the management plans for 2 patients and confirmed the plan for the 3rd. She managed 4 family calls before noon, not 3-4. Because the bypass patient's son had called twice, and the second call had required 30 minutes and had required the specific combination of clinical explanation and human presence that is the hardest skill in nursing and the most important. She reviewed the afternoon safety huddle agenda before the huddle and contributed 2 agenda items that had not been included. She wrote her shift notes in the specific, complete way she had written shift notes for 14 years, which was as close to real time as the shift allowed, and which included every clinical observation, every family communication, every deviation from standard protocol, and its rationale. She had been doing this for 14 years. She intended to do it for as long as she was in the unit. She worked the next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. She called her mother at 6:45 every workday morning. She wore the lanyard with the cartoon stethoscope border. The border had faded further over the 14 years since Simone had bought it. The stethoscopes were now a suggestion of their original bright color rather than the color itself. She did not replace it. She would not replace it. She had told Simone this, and Simone had said, "Mama, you can buy another one." Claudette had said, "I have the one you bought." Simone had said, "You are very stubborn." Claudette had said, "I know exactly what I am." The badge swung on the lanyard the way it always had, and the photograph on the badge showed her at 54 with the direct, unambiguous expression of a woman who is comfortable being seen and who intends to remain so. She had taken the photograph standing in the hallway outside her office, looking at the camera the way she looked at things she intended to see clearly without blinking. The SICU had the smell of all ICU's antiseptic recycled air, the specific undertone that monitoring equipment produces when it runs continuously, and underneath those the human smell of people in beds, which is not unpleasant, just present the smell of bodies that are being carefully maintained while they repair. She had been breathing this smell for 29 years. It had long since ceased to register as a smell, and had become simply the sensory context in which her professional life occurred, the way the sound of traffic ceases to register for people who live near highways. It was the air she worked in. She moved through it with the ease of someone who belongs. She knew the SICU by sound. She could identify without looking the tone of the ventilator alarm that indicated a patient had coughed and dislodged the circuit versus the tone that indicated a more serious disconnect. She could hear from the nursing station the difference between a monitor's routine alarm and the alarm that meant something had changed that required attention. She could hear the pace of footsteps in the hallway and know from the pace whether someone was moving quickly toward a concern or moving in the normal pattern of morning rounds. She had built these competencies over 14 years in the unit, and they were built into her now in the way skills are built when they have been practiced long enough, not consciously, not as a procedure, but as a form of perception that had become native. She would train DeShawn in this too, as much as it could be trained. Some of it came with the years. Some of it could be accelerated by good teaching. She intended to give him both. The SICU ran the way it ran on the accumulated knowledge of a charge nurse who had been there for 14 years, and who knew every patient, every protocol, every medication interaction, every edge case that the textbooks mentioned, and the ones they didn't. The unit ran on her, and she ran on what she knew, and what she knew she had built over 29 years of doing the work correctly, and the work was still there, and she was still there to do it. Her daughter, Simone, called on Sunday evening as she always did. She said, "Tell me about the week." Claudette told her about the week, the patients, the outcomes the morning that had begun with handcuffs outside the ambulance bay and had continued with the proper business of the work. Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right?" Claudette said. "I am." Simone said, "I'm proud of you, Mama." Claudette said, "I'm proud of you too, baby." She meant it the way she meant everything, completely without qualification and without needing to say it more than once. DeShawn Holloway said, at the end of that first shift when the evening charge took over and Claudette was gathering her things at the nursing station, "You all right?" She said, "I am." He said, "What you need?" She said, "I need to call my mother. She's been waiting on a call since 7 this morning." He said, "I covered the 8:15 rounds, and the troponin patient's labs came back trending down." She knew what that meant before he finished saying it. She said, "Good." She said, "Document the trend and flag it for the morning attending." He said, "Already done." She looked at him. He was 36 years old and had been doing this for 7 years and would be a charge nurse in 18 months. And he had handled every moment of this morning with the kind of composure that cannot be taught, only developed. She said, "Thank you, DeShawn." She said it as a complete sentence. She called her mother from the parking structure. Loretta answered in 2 rings. She said, "Claudette Marie." She said it with the warmth and the steadiness and the structure it had always had. Claudette said, "I'm sorry I missed the morning." She said, "Everything is fine." Loretta said, "I know everything is fine." "I know you." She said, "You're calling now, aren't you?" Claudette said, "I'm calling now." Loretta said, "Then we're fine." They talked for 8 minutes. Loretta told her about the cardinal that had been coming to the garden feeder 3 days in a row, and about the light through the east window in September mornings, which was one of the things she had always loved about September, and still loved. Claudette said, "I love you, Mama." Loretta said, "I love you too, baby. You sound like you." Claudette said, "I am me." Loretta said, "I know. That's why I said it. That's why I—" She walked out through the ambulance bay after the call, the same doors, the same concrete, the same yellow lines on the bay floor. The light was evening light now, coming from the west instead of the east, slanted and amber. The ambulance bay doors she had walked through 14,000 times, give or take, in 14 years of morning and evening shifts. She walked to her car the same way she walked every day, because the way she walked every day was the right way, and nothing that had happened that morning had changed the way she walked. She drove home the same route. She had dinner with her husband, George, who asked about her day in the way that husbands who have been married long enough ask about your day, not looking for a summary, just offering space. She gave him the shape of the day without all of its contents. He said, "You good?" She said, "I'm good." He said, "The Cardinals won tonight." She said, "I know, I heard it on the radio." They ate in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been eating together for 30 years. She called Simone again the following Sunday. Simone had been thinking about the ambulance bay story. She said, "Are you sure you're okay?" Claudette said, "I'm sure." Simone said, "I'm going to write something about this. about what happens to nurses. Claudette said, "What will you write?" Simone said, "I don't know yet, but something." Claudette said, "Write it accurately." Simone said, "I learned that from you." Claudette said, "I know. That's why I mentioned it." The SICU ran the way it ran. It ran on her, and she was there, and the work was still there. And the people who needed the work were still coming through the doors every day with their complicated physiologies and their specific fears, and their families in the waiting room, holding cups of bad hospital coffee and watching the clock. She was what stood between the door and the worst thing, and she had been what stood there for 14 years, and she intended to stand there for however long the standing was required. That was the work. It was always the work. It had not changed. She had arrived at it through 29 years of mornings, through the specific accumulation of Tuesday mornings and Wednesday mornings, and the mornings after difficult nights, and the mornings that began well, and the morning that had begun with handcuffs outside the ambulance bay doors. She had arrived at every one of them and had done the work and had gone home and had called her mother and had come back. The pattern of arrival was not disrupted by the disruptions within it. It was the pattern itself that mattered, the consistency, the return, the refusal to be the kind of person who only does the right thing when it is easy to do. She had made herself that person over 57 years. She intended to remain her. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who do not change the way they walk.